again. Thank you for coming. This is our final seminar of the convention, and we're happy to have everybody here. I'm here from the Museum of Gaming History to introduce the seminar speaker, because the Museum of Gaming History puts on these seminars. But it is interesting to note that Charles Kaplan is the chairman of the Museum of Gaming History. And unlike what it says in the program, at that point it was acting, but he is now the chairman for certain of the Museum of Gaming History. And his presentation, I won't review that, but you know that Charles does the chip guide and many other things for the club, and we're happy to have him here to learn about bad guys in Cuba.
There weren't bad guys in Cuba. Get more comfortable here. Usually dress a little bit more formally, but I figured we're going down to the Caribbean, the Locksman, and we'll have a good time. Jim, could you do me a favor?
Yeah.
Just get me a little water or lemonade or something.
Of course.
So, what I'd like to talk about today is how the mafia came to own Cuba. And how can you think it's possible that a legal organization could come to own a government? And that's what we're going to explore today and figure out how that was able to happen. And we're going to start by looking at Cuba, and we could see it's only 90 miles from Key West to Havana. So its proximity to the United States was very important in how we got to that point. And what you need to know is, back when Cuba was Cuba, which was before Fidel Castro, it's a government that was a weak government that was plagued by corrupt presidents, and you know the term "banana republic" reflected Cuba and the rest of the Caribbean. But at that time, Cuba was the most advanced country in the Caribbean by far. A lot of places are still, you would still consider to be third world. But nonetheless, you had a very vibrant population. They loved music, they loved life, like to gamble and have a good time, and Americans like to go there, but not every American, because prior to World War II, only the very wealthy could travel down to Cuba. Airfare was prohibitively expensive. And if you don't go by air, you had to go by boat. Who had enough time to sail down to Cuba and have a vacation and come back? So it was really only the wealthy. It was the playground of the wealthy in the early days. And we're going to talk about several individuals who were key in the development of the mafia in Cuba. And the first two guys are Meyer Lansky on the left, and his childhood friend, Charles Lucky Luciano. They grew up in the same area, the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and at a young age became familiar with each other and formed a gang, along with another friend that you probably know, Bugsy Siegel. So the three of them palled around in gangs, doing low-level crime stuff, and eventually progressed and made their way to near the top of the mafia. And at that time, there were two guys who were battling to be the capo de capo, the boss of bosses for the mafia. And I'm going to say it was Lansky, because he was the smarter one, who figured out this is our strategy. We're going to side with one of these two guys and tell him, with your help, we're going to rub out the other guy. And they did that. And after they did that, they came back and rubbed out that guy. Luciano was the capo de capo, the boss of bosses, although he didn't like to assume that position because he knew if whoever had that position had a bullseye on his back. So you could say that Luciano was the figurative head of the mafia because he was Sicilian, but the guy who really understood how to make money for the mafia, who was called the mafia's treasurer, was Lansky. And what else should we talk about that? So Lansky's biggest interest in the mafia was casinos. And he operated illegal casinos throughout the United States, Saratoga, Miami, Galveston, all the places that were resort locations before there were legal casinos, or you could only go to Nevada for a casino. And background on Luciano, they could not get him on anything. He was a Teflon Don. But they finally got him on prostitution, sentenced him 30 to 50 years in jail for prostitution. During World War II, the United States was having major losses at sea. Supply ships leaving the United States to help Europe, our allies in Europe, were being sunk far too often than should have been. So the United States military came to Luciano in jail. They knew that he controlled the waterfront in New York and asked for his help in identifying spies so they could weed them out and not have the information on American ships, helping the war effort get out. And he did that. And after the war was over, they released him from prison, but they deported him back to Italy. So you need to know that part before we get started. And then there were two other individuals who also, funny enough, came from the same neighborhood. The guy on the left over here is Fulgencio Batista. Started out in the military and eventually became president of Cuba. And I forgot what town they came from, but he came from a town that was involved with sugar harvest. And Batista's father cut the sugar cane. Castro came from the same area. His father worked for the same company, but he worked in the office. And the sugar company kind of controlled the economy there. They built homes for their workers. You know, so Castro lived in the upper scale neighborhood. He had a good education, he got an American education, and Batista came from lower class. But they were both ambitious, successful, intelligent guys, and became successful in their lives. So, anything more about these guys right now? And by the way, I teach at the university level. It's one of the jobs that I have. And when I teach, I want it to be interactive. Because I don't know what you don't know, I don't know what questions you might have. So if something pops up, you're not interrupting me, you're probably making the seminar a little bit better by giving some more information that I probably didn't think about was interesting.
Well, Charles, I have a question for you then, and this probably has to do with your thinking. A lot of people argue that when Batista got overthrown, basically they went out of the frying pan and into the fire. Did the average Cuban, did they do better under Castro than they did under Batista?
So the jury's out on that, I would say, because the money that was coming into Cuba went into the hands of the powerful and the wealthy. It didn't filter down to the average person, by and large. But it was a vibrant economy with lots of people coming in. They had restaurants, and so there was more money coming in. And the reason for the overthrow, we'll get to it, was it was a corrupt government. And I'll let you know now. It was a corrupt government. They were on the take, getting fabulously wealthy off of kickbacks from the casinos. And there was a lot of public support that says, why are all these individuals making so much money when the average person isn't really sharing in it? And that was the fuel for the revolution. So after the revolution, they weren't communists yet. But when they nationalized the industries to kick out the Americans so that they could control their own industries, that's when they became desperate to have a backer, and that backer was the Soviet Union. So they became communists. But when Castro kicked out Batista, he was welcomed back to the United States as a hero for kicking out the corrupt dictator of Cuba. He did a victory tour, you know, and he gathered support for his movement in the United States before he went to Cuba and had the revolution. So we didn't see them as an enemy until later. Okay. So those are the four individuals we'll be talking to, and there was one other guy we will talk to. So let's talk about pre-World War II. And pre-World War II, it was very expensive to travel down to Cuba, so only the wealthy were down there. It was the playground for the wealthy. Anything that you wanted, you can get for a price in Havana. That was the motto. And as far as casinos were concerned, Cubans liked to gamble, but there were just small little locally owned casinos. Santos Trifacante from Tampa did own some small casinos at the time in Cuba, but it really wasn't a big deal at that time. And the thing to know is all the casinos there were crooked. They were stealing from their customers, but not offering honest games. So you need to keep that in mind for later. So World War II, you know, not a lot going on. And then what happens? The number one thing that made the mafia what it is, prohibition. The United States said alcohol is illegal, and the mafia said, let's bring up the cash register because people are not going to stop drinking. And the mafia brought in alcohol from Canada, from the Caribbean, from Cuba, from Mexico. You know, that they knew how to do that business, and that made the mafia from a bunch of street hoods into organized crime. It made more money for them than you could imagine. So Cuba was used as an entry point of alcohol coming into the United States. And Lansky was down there in the 20s. And the significant part about it, as far as this presentation is concerned, is that he made relationships with people. He knew how to operate. And to operate legal businesses, you need cooperation from those who could interfere with your business. And that's what he was good at. So back in the 20s, when Batista was an officer in the Army, they found each other, got to know each other, and that's when their relationship started. So as far back as the 20s, they were using Cuba to import alcohol and narcotics. And here's a book that was written about smuggling alcohol to Cuba to the south during Prohibition. There are a couple of the bottles of Cuban rum over there. And I had thought, mafia being in Cuba, they would get into the other vices that they were involved in, like prostitution. But they were smart. They know they needed local cooperation. And prostitution in Cuba was common back then. And if they had tried to muscle in, it would have upset a lot of people who were probably already on the take from those people to let them operate prostitution. So I thought they would be involved, but they stayed out of the local vices at that time.
Was there really a Superman?
Yes, there was.
I was waiting for someone to bring that up.
So then what happens? We have a depression. Prohibition goes away. There's no need for the mafia to import illegal alcohol anymore. And then we get hit with a depression and nobody's traveling. So very little is happening in Cuba. After Prohibition ends, and then what happens after that? World War II. So nobody's traveling. So until the end of World War II, there was very little going on in Cuba as far as the mafia was concerned. But then the war's over. What happens after the war is over? And I just wanted to show you this because this is pre-World War II, and this is the kind of clientele that was going down to Cuba. The very, very wealthy would go out in the evening in a tuxedo. So, yes, that was Sloppy Joe's bar. I was there. We'll talk about my visit to Cuba in a little while. I didn't dress like that, though. So, what are the consequences of World War II? Wars, while they are very destructive, also bring about advances in technology. And one of the advances in technology was airplanes. World War II was the first big war that involved the use of airplanes. So after World War II is over, you have a tremendous excess of airplanes that they don't need anymore, and pilots. And what happened then was airfare became affordable to the middle class. And I'm from New York City. For vacations, people drove to a couple of hours north of New York City to the Catskills. That's why the Catskills were so popular. That was the resort area. They drove down to Atlantic City. But then after World War II, they flew down to Miami. They flew to Niagara Falls, to Bermuda, and they started flying to Cuba as well. So after post-World War II, you started seeing an increasing volume of American tourism in Cuba. And it's all because of cheap airfares compared to before World War II. And that leads us to the Havana Conference. And you're probably all familiar with the Havana Conference from the Godfather movie. Godfather 2 shows the Havana Conference, although it's not historically correct. Because when they show the scene where they're on the roof celebrating Lansky's birthday, the conference happened in late December 1946. Lansky's birthday is in June or July. And the conference was 1946, and right after the conference is when the revolution occurred, which didn't occur till New Year's Eve 1958. So it's kind of a little conglomeration of things, but it's not historically accurate.
Which tower did Lansky say?
You don't know.
I do.
Really? Well, share, please.
Oh, I think it's fairly well known. I've been to the Hotel Nacional, and I think it was on that porch up there in the tower, in the right-facing side. But that was always his room.
Okay.
He had that suite of rooms up there.
Okay, so for the conference, they rented out the entire hotel for a week. December 22nd to 29th. Mafia had this hotel, everything was shut down, the public couldn't be involved. But word about it got around because it was such an ostentatious event. What happened with the 1946 conference? Well, the one that we're most familiar with is they decided the fate of Bugsy Siegel. Bugsy muscled in on the construction of the Flamingo. He was stealing from the Virginia was stealing from them, and all the construction people were stealing from it. So a $2 million project became a $6 million project. And then when it opened, it flopped. It opened on Christmas Eve, 1946. And what happened? There was a storm in LA. All the LA movie stars that were supposed to be there couldn't be there, and they had no crowd. So they knew he was stealing. It started out as a flop. And even though Lansky was a childhood friend, he had to bow to the sentiments of the rest of the attendees there. And that's when they decided his fate. And then 6 months later, when he was at Virginia Hill's home in Beverly Hills, that's when the rub out occurred.
Well,
remember, they don't do any rub outs in Vegas.
On the opening of the Flamingo, didn't it rain?
Yeah, it was a terrible storm.
All flights out of LA were grounded.
So, circumstances, but I think it was trying to steal from the mob is not a good idea.
They rushed in to get that grand opening. Jimmy Durante was the headliner of Rosemary, and Xavier Cugat was there. And we were there playing with an empty house.
But what else did they do there? They decided what the strategy was going to be for the families, making it an open town like Vegas was an open town, so that everybody could operate and get a share of the action there. And they cemented their relationships with the local authorities that they needed to in order to proceed. So that was the Havana Conference. And I'm not going to show you I had a clip from the Godfather 2 that had the scene on the rooftop.
Smoke a piece.
Do you want to see it?
Godfather.
So, am I correct in saying that at the time of this conference, that the mob did not have gambling in Cuba?
They had littles. River Conti was there from Tampa.
Right, you had mentioned that already, yeah.
While we're leading up to that, this was not filmed in Havana. It was actually filmed in Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. It kind of has a similar architecture from that time. As far as the cars, when the United States stopped doing business with Cuba in 1959, they couldn't get American cars anymore. So American cars from the 1950s and earlier were still in operation.
Continuing to work with Cuba, por continuar trabajando con Cuba, the greatest period of prosperity, por el más grande periodo de prosperidad in our entire history, en toda nuestra historia. Mr. William Shaw, representing the General Food Company, representando the General Food Company, Mr. Congo Lantan, señores Congo Lantan, United Telephone and Telegraph Company, the United Telephone and Telegraph Company, Mr. Perry, señor Perry, Regional Vice President of the Pan American Mining Corporation, regional de la Pan American Mining Corporation, Mr. Robert
sure that everything goes well after he's gone.
Not for years.
Yeah, we'll see. The doctors will disagree, but what do they know? These are wonderful things that we've achieved in Havana, and there's no limit to where we can go from here. This kind of government knows how to help business, to encourage it. The hotels here are bigger and swaggier than any of the rough joints we put in Vegas. And we can thank our friends in the Cuban government, which has put up half of the cash with the Teamsters on a dollar-for-dollar basis, has relaxed restrictions on imports. What I'm saying is that we have now what we have always needed, real partnership with the government. Smaller piece. You all know Michael Corleone, and we all remember his father. At the time of my retirement, or death, I turn over all my interest in the Havana operation to his control. But all of you will share. The Nacional will go to the Lakeville Road boys. The Capri to the Corleone family. The Sevilla Biltmore also, but Eddie Levine of Newport will bring in the Benino brothers, Dino and Eddie, for a piece and also to handle the actual casino operations. And we've saved a piece for some friends in Nevada to make sure that things go smooth back home. I want all of you to enjoy your cake. So, enjoy.
Sorry, it's just been thinking. A rebel was being arrested by the military police. And rather than be taken alive, he exploded a grenade he had hidden in his jacket. He killed himself, and he took a captain in the van. Right, Jim?
But it occurred to me, the soldiers are paid for. The rebels aren't.
What does that tell you? This country has had rebels for the last 50 years. It's in their blood, believe me, I know. I've been coming here since the 20s. We were running molasses out of Atlanta when you were a baby. The trucks, only a farmer. Michael. I'd rather we talked about this when we were alone. You told me you never got to the island.
The 2 million that never got to the island did get to the island. It was delivered a couple of months later by Frank Sinatra. The mafia used Frank as a bagman. So what else led to the mafia in Cuba? The Cavalva hearings. It was meant to root out corruption in the United States where local officials were cooperating with the mob to let them run casinos. So what did this do? It shut down all the casinos, except the casinos running in Nevada, legal casinos. So you have all those people who know how to operate casinos. What do? Some of them go to Vegas, some of them go to Cuba. So another unintended result out of what was attempted to be a good thing turned out to have a different kind of effect. So Lansky's folks wound up going to Cuba to run the casinos in Cuba. I don't remember where this picture was from, but it does show
It's a national.
it's a national. And I like the way everybody is in their best formal attire. They're attending.
Their room is still there, but it's big and small.
So these are some of the individuals that were in Cuba. You see Lansky and Luciano. And what I forgot to tell you was, so Luciano was deported back to Italy. he didn't stay there very long and made his way to Cuba. And rather than being like a Lansky who liked to lay low and not be seen, Luciano was flamboyant. So it was quickly known that he was back in Cuba, and the American authorities knew about it, but really didn't do anything until he got so flamboyant that he started making the society pages. And then there was something to do, and the United States came to Cuba and said, unless you deport Luciano, we're going to stop sending you medical supplies. So Luciano was gone, deported back to Italy a second time, and now Lansky is the guy in charge. There's Santos Trificante, now over here from the Tampa mob. His family had been in Cuba for a long time. And if you look at all the casinos that opened up, it was either a Lansky casino or a Trificante casino with a lot of other partners and intermixed or whatever. But they were either controlled by Trificante or by Lansky. Jake's?
Charles?
Yeah.
Some of the reading I've done on Cuba, because the casinos were so poorly run and corrupt, even by, okay.
Getting there. Jake Lansky ran the casino operations at the Nacional. Batista, I'm going to say Sevilla Biltmore, although I'm not really great to remember those things. George Rapp, the front man for the Casino de Capri, former actor, a tough guy. Stasi had one of the casinos. Marlena was another one who had a local casino. We know Wilbur Clark, and he was the front man for the National. Lefty Clark had the Tropicana. The Cellini brothers were mentioned in the film clip we just saw. They had run a dealer school for the mob in England, and then were brought here to run that dealer school here. And Louis McWilliams is another Nevada guy who came here. So these are some of the individuals that were involved. But before I get there, I want to bring up Steve's point that when Batista became president, he made deals, and that was the scene in the boardroom with all the executives. He made deals with Lansky, and effectively he was on Lansky's payroll. He was getting a big cut of all the operations in all the casinos, as were many other high-ranking members of the government and the military and the police, because they all had a say in what was going on there. But that, to Lansky, was this is the way we operate. It's a business expense the same way we pay rent. That's the way they did business. And Batista had the idea of making Havana the Monte Carlo of the East, to make it elegant and grand and be as luxurious and desirable a place as Monte Carlo was. But he knew up until that point that in order to get there, he had to bring in the high rollers. High rollers didn't go to Cuba in that era because the casinos didn't offer an honest game. They were cheating their customers. The perfect guy to clean that up was Lansky. Lansky had a reputation for running honest games. So Batista brought in Lansky to be gaming control. And there were 10 mob-operated casinos when he started, and he went to all of them and said, you have 6 months to clean up your act or you got out. And 8 of the 10 did, and 2 were out. And the government then deported those individuals that Lansky said weren't offering the honest games. So Lansky was, in fact, brought in to be the head of the casino industry in Cuba. When he talks about the cooperation of the government with the mafia, that's what they were talking about. And Lansky, who was probably public enemy number one 90 miles away, was now a high-ranking individual in Cuba. And the pinnacle of his success there was the Havana Riviera. He got to build a new hotel that was the most luxurious. It was the first hotel in the entire Caribbean that had air conditioning, central air conditioning. Others had window air conditioners, but this was the first fully air-conditioned hotel in the Caribbean. So here he is, owner, operator, most luxurious. On the books, he appears as the head of the restaurants, because he, again, liked to be low-key. But in fact, this was his hotel and casino that he operated. So I think that's what you wanted to bring up, and thanks for the reminder, Steve.
I was just asking like too, I think it opened like 57, and it's only open for a year or two until the Revolution.
Yeah, and that was not the only one that was recently opened up. After the Riviera, the Hilton opened up. Hilton was half owned by the government, but operated by the mob. And it was Cliff Jones. You know Cliff Jones, former lieutenant governor of Nevada, who was kicked out of office. And he was also a Lansky associate. Right. Here's an FBI letter, and I find this fascinating that you can go out on the internet and do a search and come up with stuff like this. So this is a letter from March 27th, and it talks about the Treasury Department has little occasion to pay attention to gamblers in Cuba, with the exception of a few who are suspected of trafficking in narcotics, such as William G. Bishkoff, also known as Lucky Clark, and Santa Trifacante. And you could get a lot of information about who was involved with which casinos through this, through these type of FBI letters. And there's lots of them out there that you could, if you want to research them and find them, you can see them there. And now I want to take a brief detour. I had the opportunity to go to Cuba in 2014. It was before you could go there for a short while as a tourist. In order to go there, you had to go on a humanitarian effort. And I was went with a group of 11, and there were several doctors in our group, and we went under that guise, and we visited some hospitals, old age home, a nursery, like a kindergarten for children. And at that time, you couldn't just go there as a tourist. You had to go there for some humanitarian effort. So that was that. But we got to go to a cigar factory. We got to visit cultural places. And we got to see a lot and have a good time. And those were the tours we were on. But you have to remember is when you go to Cuba, Cubans are there with open arms. They want Americans as long as everybody else is welcome to come here and have a good time. It's the United States government that has an issue with it. So in order to go there, you needed what was called a professional license. And it's a piece of paper that you fill out, and basically, when you go to Cuba and you go to immigration, they let Americans in, they don't stamp your passport. And you can't go there directly. We went to Cancun and got a flight from Cancun to Cuba. It's when you come back into the United States, and we were coming back from Cancun again, where they want to know where you've been. And we were in Cuba and Mexico. And there were 11 of us. only one of the 11 was asked to show their professional license. And what the professional license really is, it just says, while we're in Cuba, we didn't do anything we weren't supposed to do. It's just like you're signing an agreement that says you were a good person there. We weren't allowed to bring back rum or cigars. The only thing we could bring back was educational or art, educational stuff or art. But anybody know what the cigar is? It's an Edsel. And that's, again, like I said earlier, in 1959, the automobile stopped flowing from the United States to Cuba. So there are thousands and thousands of 1959 and earlier American vehicles in Cuba. This one is exceptionally maintained. It's probably the best car that we saw the whole time there. Many of these are used as taxis, and they're just like held together with spit and glue. They're not comfortable on the inside. They run. That's about it.
Right. Well, part of the reason for that there's so many of the older cars there, is that Cubans could not buy cars for a long period of time unless you were a government official or somebody else. But the average Cuban couldn't do it, and they did everything they could to keep the cars running.
The mafia, the best thing they could do is gift an official a car. And they regularly gave away cars. That was a cheap way for them to get what they wanted. So we were there in 2014, and we got the opportunity to visit Nacional. So that's the front of the Nacional Hotel in 2014. And we got to go to this bar. And in the bar, those panels that you see on the wall, each one's from a different decade. And they show the famous individuals who visited the hotel in that era. And this one was from the 1930s. And I know Capablanca up over here was a famous chess player, Buster Keaton, Errol Flynn, Tom Mix, Rita Moreno, I guess, Johnny Weissmuller, Gary Cooper, and then Lucky Luciano, Mayor Lansky, Triplicante. I don't know that guy. But there they are on the wall of the National Hotel.
Do me a favor, before you go to the next slide, I want to take a photo of that if you don't mind, John. Thank you.
Here's a picture of the casino. I think that's when it first opened in 1956. And this is, we were in the actual room that was the casino in the hotel, and that's what it looks like today.
Small.
We also went to the Riviera. And that's the Riviera from outside, and the front entrance, the lobby, and the entrance to the casino. And
Amazing how the logo is the same from all.
And that is the casino. That was the room that held the casino. It was called an egg-shaped room, and you could see it's got that oval look to it. And while I was there, we happened to go past a outdoor flea market that they were selling mostly junk, housewares, and there wasn't much for tourists by there. And then we walked around for a bit, and we did see a couple of vendors who were selling casino chips. Most of the chips were the pre-World War II era, so they weren't really exciting. And we bought a few of those. The ones from the mob era, they value very highly, more so than we do here. So I didn't buy any of them because I could buy them cheaper here than I could there. But I did ask, is there any place in town where you could buy casino chips? And they referred me to a bookstore that was next to Sloppy Joe's bar. which you saw the early picture from, which was a couple of blocks from our hotel. And I went over there. They had a couple of binders with chips in it, and it was the same stuff we saw at the flea market. But, you know, I bought some. But hanging on the wall, they had this, and I'm sorry it's not great quality, but what you have is a $1, $5, and $25 chip from most of the mob-owned casinos. Casino Capri is at the top. I think that's the Riviera, the Hilton, St. John's, Tropicana, that's the Tropicana, Montmartre, and that's the Plaza. And then I decided a few months ago that I wanted to do the same thing. So what you see over here is my attempt at doing it. But I'm going to do a 1, 5, 25, and 100. It's real hard finding those. I came here expecting to fill at least a few holes, but it can't find anything here. So this stuff is rare. And a lot of the collectors stayed away from Cuban stuff because after the revolution, some of the casinos were destroyed by rioters. Some stayed open for a while, but they were not run by the mafia. They kicked the mafia out. And we don't know how much stuff is there. You know, there may be people in Cuba who've got thousands and thousands, so not knowing how much is out there really kind of hurts the market. But in all the years, I know Steve is a big collector of Cuba. This stuff just doesn't come out.
I'll tell you a funny story about Cuba. I thought about it before. I had a contact with someone in Cuba. It's going back a lot of years ago. And I got some chips from them. But lo and behold, I get a letter from the government. They were confiscated. So I had to make a trip into the old World Trade Center, because that's in the basement is where they had their holdings for all this kind of stuff. And I had to show them affidavits, documents, this and that. They were pre-Castro chips. And that was the only way I was able to get them.
Yeah, they didn't do it. No
I
new
didn't think
issues
about that
after
story
history.
when we were talking outside,
Yeah.
and I said that was the one time I said, oh my God, I'm gonna get thrown into jail for collecting.
So the stuff is rare, and you know, and all the time I've been following it, I've never seen any kind of quantity of these chips come out. The only exception would be Casino du Capri, because they had an original set, their Humboldt chips, and then they ordered another set, the second line down over here, HCE chips. Those chips never made it to the casino. So those are out in quantities. So Casino du Capri, if you see the HCE chips, they're nice chips, just don't pay a lot for them. You'll always see them in new condition. And they never actually were used on the tables. They were ordered for the casino, but the revolution got in the way. So before I show you collectibles from all the mob-owned casinos, I want to bring up the question. And this is how I figure that the mob came to own Cuba. If the mob is running the casinos and the mob is paying off everybody in power, it means all the government officials and the military and the police are on the payroll of the mafia. So who's the boss? Right? What they say goes. They're the guys who are, paying the salaries. And that's what I mean when I say how the mafia came to own Cuba. It's because everybody was on the take from the mafia.
There's a lot of stuff going on. Prostitution, drugs, and the locals handle it.
And the one thing we didn't mention that was going on, the mafia was smart enough to open up banks. So they ran banks so they could get the money back to the United States and into their accounts.
Were they open banks to the general public?
No, these were like private banking.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you know, there are banks and then there are banks. There are banks of commerce. And this was a bank of commerce. Banks of commerce, not just one. I think each family had their own bank that they ran in Cuba. So we start with the nightclubs, and yes, Tropicana. And the Tropicana was owned by a local, Martin Fox, but Lou McWillie and, oh God, who was the boss there? And Lefty Clark were involved with the Tropicana. And you can see up there, the dice, say Lefty Clark, Tropicana dice.
The nightclub is still open.
When we visited the nightclub, and when you go into the nightclub, they give the gentleman a cigar, and when you sit down at the table, they give you a bottle of Cuban rum for like the table. And my sister, who smoked cigars, took exception. They gave the women, I think, flowers. She said, "Can I get a cigar?" And then it was like a big huddle of people. She eventually got a cigar. And Sansucci, this was one of the older ones that Civiconti was involved with. And some really nice inlaid chips there, extremely hard to find. And my mantra was Mayor Lansky's, and the roulette chips are really nice. The denomination chips are kind of mediocre, I would say. And then we have the hotel casinos. And the big ones were the Casino de Capri, the Hilton, Seville, Biltmore, Casio, Casino de Capri, George Raft was the front man. And he was like the greeter who was there to welcome in guests. And there's a good story about him. When the revolution occurred, they had rioters tear up the Plaza Hotel, which is directly across the street from where we stayed when we were there at the Park Central. And there are pictures that you can see of the rioters throwing the gambling equipment out on the street. And then they went over to the Casino de Capri. And George Raft, it is said, the legend is, got in front of the casino and stared down the mob. It's basically, if you're gonna get in there, you're gonna have to go through me. You think you're man enough to do it? And he saved it. Now, after the casinos didn't shut down right after the revolution, the rioters took out a couple, but they could continue to operate. The mafia was gone. The mafia was arrested, or they got out like Michael Corleone did, you know, some way. So casinos did operate for some time afterwards until communism set in, and then it was a good thing anymore. Maybe like 1960.
I think it was 60. He said it was late in the season. The season for them was wintertime, of course. I think they said they reopened for a short period in 1960, but then everything became nationalized, and that was it.
The Havana Hilton was a hotel that Cliff Jones operated, and Cliff Jones again was former lieutenant governor of Nevada, who was kicked out of office. He was an attorney who helped make a lot of the deals for the classic Vegas casinos of the 1950s. But then he was used as somebody with reputation that could go in. Havana Hilton was owned by Cubans, but the casino was operated by the mafia. And These are the toughest ones to find. I think they're the most attractive of all the Cuban chips, and you just can't find them. They never come up for sale.
I think dollar is a blue one. I think I had a blue dollar as well.
There are some off-color ones. I actually have an off-color $5 chip. But it was quite something. All right, so it was Bill Moore, that was Battisti, and he was actually there, one of the early casinos before the mafia came in after World War II. And the National. It's amazing how closely these look like the Desert Inn chips. And if you do a quick glance, it looks like a Desert Inn chip. But they're also nice chips. These I find they're around. You can buy them. That is where it's another fear. And this is, by the way, my favorite casino postcard. I like to collect postcards because they give you addresses, and sometimes they're dated or they've been used at a certain time, so they give you dates of operation, approximate. But it's hard to find a lot of times where a casino is located. And postcards are a good way to get that information. And the Deauville and another casino had just barely opened, St. John's. They were both Trafficante casinos, and they had just barely opened when the revolution occurred. So when you see chips from these places, they're usually in great condition. But unfortunately, those casinos were not open for a very long time. And there are the St. John chips. The plaza was just out. So this is the Plaza Hotel. I stayed in this hotel over here, which was Park Central. And if you went down this street 2 blocks, that's where Sloppy Joe's was. And if you went this direction and that direction, that's where the Florida bar was, Florida bar, that Hemingway used to hang out to. We got to go to Hemingway's place while we were there, a little outside of town. There's always been controversy about these, if they were used in Cuba or not. Some people said they were from Montana, but we've been able to confirm that these are Cuban chips.
When you were there, did you have like a person walking around from the government with you, or were you on your own?
So everybody in Cuba works for the government. We had a guide, and we had our own like minibus. We were comfortable 11 people in it, and a driver. And everybody gets paid the same salary there, whether you're driving a bus or doing brain surgery. That's the communist way. Each according to their need, and you get what you need, and you contribute what you can contribute. So in the Caribbean, Cuba has the best medical schools. One of the biggest exports from Cuba are doctors. And doctors love to go because if you're a doctor here, you have a lot of responsibility, but you're getting the same pay as this guy sweeping the streets. And some of the better jobs in Cuba are the ones that interface with tourists, because you get tips. And because of that, they have 2 currencies in Cuba. They've got a local currency and a tourist currency. So they know who's getting the tips, and they control it somewhat. Another great job there is a cigar roller. We went to the cigar factory, we watched guys rolling cigars, and after 5 minutes I said, this is the most boring job in the world. You're doing the same thing over and over and over again. They're all happy. Why are they happy? They get to take a few cigars home every day, and those cigars sell for a lot, and they can sell them and supplement their income. So being a cigar roller is a good job. Funny thing about the cigar factory, so what did the supervisors do there? You've got all these guys sitting at benches, rolling cigars all day long. The supervisors sit at a stage in front of them and read communist propaganda. And then you hear it over the loudspeakers.
They just, if you go to Tampa and you go to some of the cigar makers in Tampa, they did the same thing, but it wasn't propaganda. they were reading novels, and the newspaper to whoever was rolling the cigars. I tried to go, well, we almost made it to Cuba in 2016, and they had relaxed the laws a little bit, and it was a little bit more relaxed from the U.S. government. And Cuba, when you went in, they wanted you to pay for the $75 to come into the country, and it was a little piece of paper. That was it you got from Cuba. From the United States government, you got 3 pages of what you can't do, and an 8.5 by 14 sheet of places you can't visit because the money went directly to the government. And the Hotel Nacional was on that list. You were able to go to the other ones, but the Hotel Nacional was on the list. That was directly government owned, and you couldn't go there.
So we got off on a tangent. So we had a tour guide. That was a friendly tour guide. We had a good time, but we knew we had a government official who was, showing us around.
Big Brother was watching.
They had begun to allow some private enterprise in Cuba. The best restaurants we went to were privately owned places. The government restaurants sucked. Just, they were not. What else? The rest about Cuba. Okay.
Streets of Havana with all the common buildings and occupied structures. And I remember flying in there a few years ago. University group, we had OPAC licenses, and there was an elderly person in the group. And we went to Hemingway's house and went downtown. And I was commenting, I said, the government here just run this place to crap. I mean, it looked like a European city that had been bombed in World War II. And this old guy said to me, no, that was there in the 50s, long before Castro took over. The place was run down, and it gets a lot of attacks from weather and storms and hurricanes. But half the buildings, the upper floors are empty.
So there was a question earlier about were the people better under communism or, pre-Castro. I'm going to say probably life is better for them right now. They don't have to struggle as hard as they used to, but there isn't a lot of extra money around to restore buildings. And when the travel restrictions relaxed in Cuba, and now cruise ships were going down there, I'm saying that could be both good news and bad news. The bad news is you now have lots of Americans going down there, and Americans want certain things, and I don't want to see a McDonald's in Cuba. Or all of the other things that Americans would want to have down there. If they open up McDonald's, it's going to close down 3 or 4 other restaurants run by locals there, and it's going to change the character of the nation. Right now, when you go to Cuba, it's kind of like you walk back 50 years in time, especially because you have all the old cars. They're reminding you of what it used to be. There are a lot of crumbling buildings there. So the good part about relaxed tourism is every time a boat, cruise ship comes into port, that probably pays for the restoration of one of these buildings. So if they handle it right and don't let it change their character, it's probably a good thing.
Otherwise, you're gonna have Ronald McDonald and Burger King having their own conference at the top of the mess.
So we'll kind of move over time. Here's a Life magazine. The topic is U.S. gambling mob in Cuba, new upsets on a troubled island. And this is what led to Luciano being deported, because he was so flamboyant and he got into the news. And then, of course, we get to the revolution. Christmas Eve, 1958, and Castro takes over. Batista flees to the United States and lived the rest of his life in the United States. And Mayer-Lansky's comment was, I guess I crapped out, because he had made this huge investment a year earlier in the Riviera, did an unbelievably great job, and now he's on the next flight out of Cuba. There was George Raft, and the pictures of the rioters at the Plaza Hotel across the street from where I stayed, tearing up the place. One of the things that came out of the mob being in the Caribbean, so after the Cuba was no longer available to them, they scattered to the rest of the Caribbean. They opened up casinos all over the place. And one of the best things is we've got these great chicks that came out of the Caribbean from the mob owned casinos. And, you know, my favorite one is the Caribbean chick, Caroline. Where I get my information, you would not believe how much info is out there, how many books. For this presentation, this was the best one, Don the Nocturne. It goes through the whole history of the mob involvement into Cuba. And then another guy wrote a book, and he consulted with me a little bit about it before it came out. This has great pictures of what was going on in Havana prior to Castro. Peter Rousey. And that's another one of the FBI files. That's where I got a lot of my information from. So that kind of is the end of the story, except there is a footnote. Cuba, the mafia was back in Cuba. But this time, they were hired by the FBI to exterminate Castro, and they weren't successful. So that was the end of the mafia in Cuba. I thank you for coming. And sharing your experiences. So thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Charles is available over at the note table if you have follow-up questions. Right?